Okay, folks. So welcome to IPAC's annual general meeting for 2022. I almost said 2020 in my head, and I don't know where that came from, but that says something about the last 2 years, I think. My name is Emmett Collins. I am the chair of IPAC Manitoba for another couple of hours. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here today to what we hope is our last entirely virtual AGM. I think the virtual format will continue to some extent, but we considered whether we should do a hybrid event for this AGM, and we figured if we're going to go back into in-person events, let's do something slightly more exciting than an AGM. So we do look forward to seeing you in person again soon, but not quite today. Before we get any further, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement that IPAC Manitoba works on the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Ininiwak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, and Dene, and on the homeland of the Métis. We acknowledge the distinct histories of the 7 numbered treaties that apply on this land. We recognize that public administration and public policy have been used as tools of colonialism and the harm this has caused Indigenous people. We're committed to promoting public administration in a way that advances reconciliation in a spirit of collaboration with Indigenous people and communities. So before we get to our business meeting later in the event today, we are going to begin with our keynote, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Susan Prentice, who is the Duff Roblin Professor of Government at the University of Manitoba and a Professor of Sociology. She was one of the 15 members of the Federal Expert Panel on Early Learning and Childcare and a member of the Statistics Canada Expert Advisory Group. She's a former Margaret Laurence Chair in Women's Studies, and she's going to be speaking to us today about redesigning childcare in Manitoba, administrative challenges. So without any further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Prentice.
Thanks so much, Emmett. I can't tell you how delighted I am to be speaking to public administration folks about this passion of mine. Let me pull up my PowerPoint and then we can get started. Okay, so what I thought I could do in the 30 minutes allotted to me is to move through 3 parts of a talk, to talk about some of the opportunities that exist right now to transform childcare in Manitoba, to talk about what that's going to look like in light of our current policy and program landscape, and from a big pool of potential things to think about, to pull out 3 tremendously important administrative challenges. And then I hope you'll ask me some questions. So that's how I'll organize my talk. The transformational possibilities that exist for childcare, early learning and childcare, really start with the commitments that the federal government has made. They proposed a multilateral framework agreement on early learning and childcare, ELCC, most of us still say childcare, back in 2017. And it laid out a framework for really transformational change, affordability, accessibility, much more. The marquee policy that most people saw was the promise of $10 a day childcare. But all of it's about the need to build a childcare that is a quality system. And the meat hit the possibilities when Budget 2021 committed about $30 billion over the next 5 years to really establish this early learning and childcare system. And for those of us who are old enough to remember CAP and the Canada Assistance Plan, going back to 50-50 cost sharing for childcare is an old echo. These possibilities are being actualized in individual agreements being made with individual provinces. Good grief, I have a twitchy mouse. Manitoba signed its agreement back in August and released its action plan that talks about how it plans to actually move forward on the federal commitments just before Christmas. And the federal money coming to Manitoba is pretty impressive. We're just at the end of a first fiscal year, which will have seen 129 million coming. In the upcoming fiscal year, it's 197 million, and it'll be a total of 1.2 billion over the 5 years of the agreement. And for those of you who don't memorize how much Manitoba spends on childcare, last year was a sort of a funny year as COVID hit the childcare sector hard, and provincial spending was just under 169 million, and the year before it was just under 200. So you can see that this is going to be close to 50-50 sharing. I just want to make a point that these federal dollars under the multilateral agreement aren't the only funds that get transferred to Manitoba. We have earlier agreements and various one-off programs, including some workforce programming that recently got some publicity, but this is what's coming. So what did Manitoba promise to do with these dollars? A bunch of things. The big commitment, and the one that's been very visible in the media, is the promise of a 50% reduction in average parent fees by the end of the current calendar year, and moving to an average of a $10 a day parent fee for preschool children by the end of 22-23. And this slippage between an average $10 a day fee and an average out-of-pocket fee of $10 will feature later in this talk. Manitoba committed to growing the childcare system by 23,000 new nonprofit childcare spaces. That's a commitment that all the provinces have signed on to, and we assume it will be in Ontario's, the last province to sign. And Manitoba also committed to equitable access to childcare, including children in vulnerable communities. On the quality front, which is mainly related to staffing and the early childhood educators who care with children, promises to commit the number of staff who have training, to do work on curriculum, and to keep and to attract and retain qualified staff to begin to redress the scandal of low wages. And then the heart of policy geeks is also found in the last point, which is a bunch of commitments to data, including an annual census of services and much more transparency about the programs that exist. So this becomes, roughly speaking, what Ottawa offers and what Manitoba has promised. What does it mean in practical terms to the milieu we find ourselves in? What does the current landscape look like? Well, over the last 10 years, this is what we've seen for changes as a, let me first give you a snapshot of Manitoba last year before I give you 10 years. Manitoba has about 212 children under the age of 12. And I'm going to give you the whole pool of children who use childcare services, even though these national agreements focus on children under 6 and under. We know from Stats Canada data that about 122,000 of these children are children with working mothers. We don't know how many have working fathers. That's not a way we track data, but there you go. And we currently live in a province that has 39,214 licensed childcare spaces. And if you think about the ambition of 2026 at the end of the agreement, you'll add 23,000 more childcare spaces to that 39, and we would end up with 62,214 spaces. This is an incredibly ambitious promise in a province that over the last 20 years has moved very slowly on growth. So here comes a 10-year overview of childcare in the province. This starts in 2001 and takes us to 2021. And you have blue bars and gold bars. The blue bars are the number of licensed childcare spaces in centers. Childcare centers are the most visible part of the childcare system. But Manitoba also licenses family homes. It's a model that's found across the country. But family homes, as you can see, are a small percentage of the total share of licensed spaces. And they've actually been dropping over the last 2 decades. This is true in Manitoba as well as across the country. So it's a smaller and smaller fraction of the total childcare service. And interestingly, there's a very strong progressive conservative focus on family home childcare. It's one of their preferred ways to deliver childcare, and it's, I think, going to run up against some of the empirical realities that doesn't seem to be a very popular job choice for people. But this is the distribution of spaces. And if you track the math, you can see that over 2 decades, we've grown the system by 16,000 spaces in 20 years. And in the next 5 years, we're going to try to grow it by 23,000 spaces. What do we know about this? Well, in a province where 93% of spaces are in centers and about 7% are in homes, we know that most of our centers are not for profit, which is a tremendous strength of the province. We know that about half of our centers are co-located in schools as tenants. It's not an equal partnership, but that's where they're located. and that we generally have quite quality enhancing regulations. The staff are one of 3 qualifications in the field. The least trained staff are CCAs. They have a 40-hour training background. Basically, it's first aid and safety introductions. But the bulk of childcare is provided by ECE 2s who have a 2-year community college degree, or ECE 3s who have a 2-year degree plus postgraduate work. We, in fact, on paper, require 2/3 of staff working with children to be ECE 2s or 3s, even though a very large share of programs can't meet these training requirements for reasons we'll get into. So this is part of the landscape that's about to be transformed by these federal dollars. Parent fees have been very prominent. And here's what we know about parent fees. We often talk about them in a daily way, but nobody pays daily rent or gets a daily salary. So annual fees make more sense. If you have an infant, baby under the age of 2, and you use licensed childcare, most of the time you'll pay about $7,800 a year for childcare in a Manitoba program. If your child is a preschooler between 2 and school age, it's about $5,500 a year. And if it's a school age child, you think about the difference between days when school is on and days when school is off, but it's about $3,500 a year for parents. You can easily see that many parents with 2 kids might be paying $13,000 a year for childcare. And so a promise of $10 a day childcare looks pretty good, because at $10 a day, a $10 a day childcare system means an annual bill of about $2,600 on a 260-day year. But Manitoba is not going to drop the fee. Instead, Manitoba is going to make fee subsidies more accessible. This is a snapshot from Manitoba's Early Learning and Childcare program, which tells potentially interested parents that there is support to eligible families to help with the cost of reducing childcare fees. Nobody gets free childcare, even at a maximum fee. It's $2 a day per child. And the province reminds potential users that eligibility for a fee subsidy depends on various factors, including your income, the number and age of your children, the number of days required for care, and the reason. This will also come up. This quick overview should persuade you that childcare really in Manitoba is a market service. It's about supply and demand. There's a minimal role for government. What the province generally does, its authority is restricted to licensing, to enforcing regulations, to providing some operating funding, and to subsidizing, as I just showed you, some low-income parents. It means that the services are delivered by non-state actors. In our province, it's primarily NGOs. Many of them have charitable status. There's a small share of commercially owned private operators who operate for-profit childcare. And this means that in Manitoba, all the service growth and all the service delivery relies on private initiatives, a nonprofit or a for-profit private. So it's a market, it's a childcare market. And if I can share with you something I don't let my students do very often, there's lots of problems with markets. And in a minute, I'll talk to you about why this is a problem. Markets are problems because they don't allow proactive planning. They don't allow demand forecasting. Markets create inequalities of access. Some neighborhoods have more service in markets. Some have fewer, what I'll call in a minute, childcare deserts. It means that there's no public accountability to when, where, and how programs set up or when they shut down. Regulation stands in for quality, and we don't have much integration of care and education, despite the potentially very interesting shift of early learning to the Department of Education just earlier in January. I like to think of it as popcorn. So if you thought about childcare as a popcorn model, what happens is when and where a community group gets it together to apply for funding and start up, boom, up pops a childcare center. But it's pretty random, just like popcorn. And it's not a very substantial way to build a system. So this popcorn model has a number of flaws, and it mitigates against any effort to try to deliver childcare as a public good. So, Dr. Google doesn't really stand in for definitions, but the Oxford Dictionary tells us that a public good is a commodity or a service provided without profits because it's a public good. And part of the ambitions contained in the national agreements are to move childcare from a market system to becoming a public good. So we have some lessons we could draw on. We can look to the European countries, especially the Nordic countries, which have made a lot of progress on delivering childcare as a public good. Comparative research finds some pretty important policy lessons. One of them just relates to how much you spend. Childcare, like any other human service that's labor intensive, costs a lot to offer. And as a benchmark, the OECD recommends spending about 1% of GDP as adequate to build an effective ELCC system. At a GDP of about 68 billion, Manitoba would have to spend about 680 million, or 3 times what we currently spend to be at this benchmark. Comparative research tells us that public management is really essential, that while there may be a mixed economy of delivery, governments should steer services, and that a fair share of services should be publicly delivered, including family childcare, which is often publicly delivered in Europe. Funding models aren't to consumers in the form of vouchers. They go directly to services in the form of supply side funding. The parent contribution to funding the system is low and capped, and educators in general are highly trained. Often in Europe, a minimum is a bachelor's degree, and often a graduate training as well. Quite unlike in Manitoba, where I showed you, most of the training maxes out at a 2-year community college degree. So where would you begin? Where we are currently, a messy market system, a historical legacy of relying on non-state actors and nonprofits to start up, own, operate, and deliver childcare, in an environment where in 4 short years, we want to see much more access, much more affordability, a bigger workforce, and 23,000 new spaces. Somebody's going to doing a lot of thinking to turn that messy ball of yarn into some organized plans. And I think that there ought to be, and I hope that there is, significant planning happening on 3 big fronts. So these are my big 3 challenges. It's this idea that parent affordability can be created through a fee subsidy model. How on earth we can ramp up expansion of 23,000 spaces in the 4 years that now remain on the agreement. And what on earth to do about an early childhood educator workforce, which is essential for quality and yet isn't out there available to be hired. So let's start with the fee subsidy. So despite some press to the contrary, the price of childcare in Manitoba has not changed. That chart I showed you a few slides back, about $7,800 a year, is still the cost of childcare. Mm-hmm. What Manitoba has done is made more parents eligible for a subsidy. But in order to get a subsidy, there are some quite strict eligibility requirements. You have to be working or in education. You can't use it just because you'd like to. Fee subsidies are time limited. You have to keep proving eligibility. Ongoing proof of subsidy is required. Very often for university students, who I worry about, eligibility for subsidy stops at the end of a school year, and students who take a summer job lose their subsidy, can't afford their childcare, have to withdraw their child from a daycare center, and come September again, they don't have a daycare space, even if they were then re-eligible for a subsidy. So the whole fee model, the whole fee subsidy model, which brings really high administrative burdens for users, for those who provide services, and in fact for the province to manage, is a problematic way. And I am not persuaded that Manitoba is going to satisfactorily be able to meet the federal objective of an average $10 a day fee by simply reducing parental out-of-pocket costs through giving more parents fee subsidies. I think this is going to be an imminent challenge for the province. Equally, I think we're in a challenging environment to figure out how to build 23,000 new childcare spaces. And one thing to think about is the concept of childcare deserts, which I introduced earlier. In this 2018 report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, researchers discovered that Manitoba is in 10th place among provinces and territories when it comes to deserts. A desert is defined as a postal code where there are more than 3 children competing for every 1 childcare spot. That's how they operationalize the definition. A third of Manitobans live where coverage rate is less than half of Winnipeg. And in Winnipeg, which has more service than anywhere else in the province, there's only 2 spots for every 5 children. And in smaller towns and rural areas, there's only 1 spot for every 5 children. So not only do we have a problem of new spaces, there will be equity issues in thinking about where to establish those centers, those new programs. And in the popcorn model, there's no capacity to steer where those new spaces will come. And this will, I think, be an administrative challenge that's going to have some resolution. So this public management of expansion is going to be a problem. As I've said, popcorn's not going to do it. We don't have mechanisms to steer expansion into deserts or into areas of higher need. And I will say the enticement that's been offered is any group that would be interested in starting up a childcare center could be eligible to apply for a $12,000 per space capital grant. And even the most optimistic planners think that the capital costs are at least $25,000 per space. So there's a capital gap to manage. Very few nonprofits can come out of nowhere, apply for funding, start up a program and offer it. And so where we have services, there's a socioeconomic gradient. Richer parts of Winnipeg, more affluent neighborhoods where social capital is higher, have more services. Poorer neighborhoods, more indigenized neighborhoods have fewer services. And this is baked into the popcorn model of relying on nonprofits to start up and deliver services. So I think we will soon need to see the establishment of some kind of a development corporation, maybe modeled on past practice with social housing, but there will need to be capacity to figure out how to design growth. If we don't do this, there's a real risk, I think, of commercial actors moving in. There are national childcare chains in Canada and internationally who will be eagerly looking to the new public funding that's coming and wanting a piece of the action. They will have capacity to start up. They will have access to capital that not-for-profits don't have. And yet very clearly, the public dollars committed to Manitoba, which are reserved for not-for-profit services, will jeopardize the dollars. The growth has to be in the not-for-profit sector for all kinds of other reasons that maybe somebody will ask me about. So this will be a problem. And then the third problem I promised is to think about the workforce. The 39,000 spaces we currently have for children 0 to 12 employ an estimated 3,400 staff, early childhood educators, and childcare assistants. But older children and younger children have different staff-child ratios. Babies are 4 babies to every staff, toddlers are 1 to 8, and school-age children are 1 to 15. So if all of your new spaces are to be in preschool spaces, we have to employ roughly as many early childhood educators as currently work in the province. That's 3,800 new folks. And if 2/3 of them must be trained, and that's even with the current regulation, not addressing what that promise to increase certification by 15% means, we'll need to have in less than 5 years, at least 2,500 new ECE 2s and 3s, all of whom will need at least a 2-year community college degree, and some of whom will need postgraduate work as well. So what's really coming is a paradigm shift. And what we have in the province is an older policy architecture built on a very different paradigm of how childcare was to be thought of. This is going to make all kinds of interesting possibilities, I think, for the civil service. So I'm so delighted to be telling you this. I think what's got to be coming, if we're to do this well, is going to be the development of infrastructure for public management, to think about increasing capacity publicly to oversee, start up, deliver, and serve underserved communities. To think about how affordability, expansion, and the workforce need to be put together in an integrated package in a model that makes childcare a public good rather than simply something for a nonprofit market. Now, I'm much more enthusiastic about nonprofit markets for childcare than I am about commercial markets for childcare, but neither of them is about public delivery, public steering, and public oversight. We won't know how well we're doing on meeting these challenges with our current data systems. It's held together with gum and dental floss, so we will need new mechanisms for data collection, data analysis, and all that's required for stronger accountability. When you put this picture together, this is why I say there are important possibilities for transformation and very important coming administrative challenges. I hope there are some questions.
Well, thank you very much for that. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But maybe, oh, I see Anastasia has her hand up. Go ahead.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I just had a question. Why the workplace childcare centers are not as popular here as they are in, say, Ukraine, for example? It's a really nice option, and in our government, in our civil service, I'm actually only aware of one building, 800 Portage, that had that on the first floor. This doesn't make sense that that option is not widely used. Thank you.
No, it's an excellent question. Workplace childcare is certainly an option for parents. It's usually the case that once children are school age, parents like to be in local neighborhoods closer to where they live than where they work, but it works well for younger children. We don't have very much of it. There are a couple in Winnipeg, Bumper Croc in the old grain exchange, Kid Gloves in the old jeans factory up near Maine and Salter. There's a few others. Hospitals generally have some. You can think of the workplace, you can think of U of M's and all the universities and colleges, lab schools and on-campus schools as like workplace childcare. But the general problem is that most employers do not want the responsibility of owning and operating a childcare program. It's a headache. It takes a huge amount of labor. There's not enough funding to make it worthwhile. And to dig into old national history, back in 2005, Stephen Harper thought that by incentivizing businesses, by offering operating grants, you could spur a wave of growth. And what he discovered to his shock was that there was not a single uptake by the part of either large or small businesses. And interestingly, when Brian Pallister introduced some tax credits recently for Manitoba modeled on the exact same policy, we've seen very little uptake in Manitoba. One of the things that does happen is that when a workplace gets public dollars to buy, build, purchase, or renovate, they acquire a private asset through public dollars, which they then own for the future. So there's a sort of a loss of money to the public sector. That's one part of it. But this is a very unfinished conversation, the role of employers in the provision of childcare. It's a good question. Kelly has one too.
Yeah, thank you. If I can go ahead. Thank you, Susan. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm a political scientist by training, and so of course I have a political question. How much does politics enter into it? You mentioned that the PC government here in Manitoba, it tends to favor private or spaces in private homes. You mentioned, of course, the former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper favoring tax credits for parents. How much does that come into these kinds of considerations? And you also mentioned that there's a lack of services in vulnerable communities, marginalized communities, compared to more affluent communities. So can you maybe expand on that a little bit more?
Well, it's everything. It's the full explanation, Kelly. We only see these kinds of transformative possibilities because the federal government made the commitment. And I hear from the agreements made yesterday for collaboration between the Liberals and the NDP that the deals are probably safe for the next 4 years. So that's important news for provinces thinking about making change. You know, historically, Canada hasn't always taken family policy very seriously. We've often thought that your family matters are your private issue. And the sort of interest in supporting working families, in accelerating maternal employment, in thinking even about conditions under which families can have the number of children they want at the timing that they want. I mean, all of these are low priorities in Canada historically. So I think the potential changes that we'll see in Manitoba wouldn't necessarily have been initiated by our current government, but since there are federal dollars, they will proceed. There was a time in my life where I thought, it's embarrassing to admit this to you all, but here goes, like that all you really had to do was win political will, right? You'd make a decision and then a highly competent and well-trained civil service would take that decision and march it down the road and make it all happen. But sort of what has to happen with childcare is the creation of capacity where none existed. We haven't had childcare planners. We have a whole infrastructure that runs our giant complicated education system. And we have 100% in Manitoba relied on independent, standalone, uncoordinated efforts of NGOs and nonprofits to run childcare. It's astonishing that it works at all in the 21st century. So we have to really rethink delivery. And this, I think, will be a twinned job, both for leadership, for political decision-making, but also for capacity in public administration. So I think this is very important. And some of these decisions, I think, require a deep knowledge. Like it does look like childcare became more affordable and not a single piece of media seemed to blink when Manitoba said it was reducing the price of childcare by making more parents eligible for a subsidy. But the price just did not change. And that is not, in fact, the same thing as making an average $10 a day fee. So a lot of the devil will be in the details. And I'm on a one-woman campaign to make sure that this is getting attention.
So you laid out a pretty stark picture of what has to happen in Manitoba.
Mm-hmm.
But looking across the country, are there other jurisdictions that are better primed to take advantage of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, in some ways it would be Ontario, but they are the last holdout who have not yet even signed a deal. What Ontario has had, it's the only place in Canada, are municipally owned and operated childcare programs. Ontario's cities, ever since the end of World War II, have played a role in the funding of childcare and in owning. So in Toronto, there's a swath of daycare centers where the staff are municipal employees. They are owned and operated. And I will point out that during the pandemic, those were the programs that got to be kept open and could be reprofiled very rapidly for taking care of essential workers. And they were a big part of keeping things going. There isn't any other jurisdiction in Canada that has any municipally owned and operated childcare, not even Quebec. But we haven't historically thought of childcare as being a political responsibility. We've seen it as a private family matter. If you want it, you buy it, you go pay for it. And we've seen it as, in some ways, proudly grassroots initiative owned by nonprofits, but it has not been a part of public planning. So Emmett, I'm sorry to say there's not a lot of good models on delivery. And even though Quebec is the shining example in North America, in the last 10 years or so, a huge share of Quebec has been bought out, owned and operated by commercial operators. Quality questions are being asked. And in some of Quebec's childcare, parents are paying more because they're out of the public system, the publicly subsidized system. So really, it's redesigned from coast to coast to coast. I see a question from Laura.
Hi. I have a question. So, I mean, there were many things about the presentation that stood out to me, but one of them is increasing by 23,000 spaces. And you indicated that it would require, I believe, 2,500 more early childhood educators, which require 2 years of college. So that to me, how are we going to train these people and train them in it? I mean, I just don't understand how that's going to work. I don't know how many are trained every year, but I'm sure it's not in the thousands.
This is one of my questions too. One of the reasons that the field is challenged is that the wages are extremely low. Working in childcare is a low wage occupation, and it's got the dubious distinction of being post-secondary training that brings you the lowest return on your human capital. Like every other training you get will give you more money in the job market than ECE training will. It's enormously satisfying work. And many childcare workers have to have a second job because they can't afford their one job. And many childcare workers can't afford childcare for their own children because they don't earn enough, but they're also, it's a long story, but our subsidy system has been so punitively restrictive. I do not know, Laura, how this will happen. And I will say that you need 2,500 even at the current ratios of training. And I gave you a little snippet in an early slide, which said the province has committed to a quality initiative of increasing training by 15%. So I don't really know what that means. It could mean that 15% more would have to be, in which case we'd go from 2/3 to 75% trained. Maybe they mean 15% more of the untrained childcare assistants would become trained. I don't really know. Inquiring minds are asking these questions too. I can say though, that the wages are going to have to be improved. This is important work. It's skilled work. It needs to be remunerated, and it's long past time to rely on women to care for children at unjust wages. So this means, in fact, that the cost of childcare will need to go up as well. It's a pickle.
Maybe just building on that point, it was interesting at the outset, you made the case that this is a market, and yet I can think of relatively few other markets where the revenue generating capacity of the operator is so clearly defined by government. So do you think there's a role there as well?
Yes, if I had you for a whole day, I could go into so much more, but Emmett, you're onto something. So in general, somewhere between 80 and 85% of the budget of a childcare center is spent on wages. It's a very green, low carbon economy that provides great jobs for women. Like it does, it's labor intensive. And yet you're asking people at the lowest arc, typically of their earning power, to pay for services. So parents tap out. It is true that Manitoba's fees they look affordable in comparison to stories like 21,000 a year in Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary. But 7,500, 5,500 is nothing to sneeze at either. So we think that an affordability measure might be a family would pay no more than 10% of their net income on childcare. That's an outside number. That figure's been used before. The United States will say 7% of net family income for an affordability index. And if we were European, in Sweden, for example, we'd say no more than 4%. Some of my research has shown that more than 2/3 of Manitobans would be paying more than 10% of their family income, even at current rates. So it's kind of like a rock and a hard place, right? Paying for childcare is very expensive, and the solution is not really to ding parents more, because for most parents, childcare already costs as much or more than housing. It's an example of market failure, economists will tell us, right? It's one of those moments where conventional economic logics of a market really don't work. It means to work, you shortchange children by quality that's dubious, and you shortchange the staff. Market failure is one of those good rationales for public interventions. Heather has her hand up.
As they all interject. Thanks for that. So thinking of it as a public good, like, do you see any value in trying to emulate the K-12 system for childcare services if the government were to take more of an active role?
I do. I think, in fact, that's one of the important lessons. The OECD has called for strong and equal partnerships. And we can do public education pretty well, all things considered, right? All communities have access. We have well-trained teachers in schools. They earn good wages. We don't expect volunteers to run schools, even though we have plenty of models for democratic input. There's some local control through the trust. We have retained some local control through the trustee model. And we even solve things like transportation. Now, schools are not organized around most working parents' working day. There are issues before school and after school, but certainly education provides a lot to borrow from. And it's potentially a very promising sign that childcare has left families and moved on over into education. We'll have to watch and see how that unfolds. I will say that we expect to collectively pay for education through taxes. You can tell me how you feel about property taxes later. But you walk into a school as a 6-year-old and your parents haven't written a check for you to walk in the door that day. So that will be an interesting challenge also, how much we retain this legacy that childcare is something you must pay for privately because it's still part of the market, and how much we anticipate it should be a right in the same way that education is a right. In which case, using fee subsidies that restrict eligibility only to approved reasons for using your subsidy won't fly. If I were inside government right now, I would think this would be an enormously rich moment to contribute to developing a structure that could help tackle these questions intelligently and well, and really take advantage of this opportunity. Does anybody know if this is happening? Anybody close enough to the action to be able to say? Probably can't say.
Okay. Are there any final questions?
I have one if I could. Susan, do you know, are there any specific directives around increasing childcare spaces? You mentioned vulnerable communities, but specifically Indigenous communities. Has that been part of the federal mandate at all?
Right. So thank you for asking, Kelly. One of the things I did to kind of stay manageable is to not talk about an Indigenous early learning and childcare framework, which is a separate agreement with its own funding mandates, which is going to have an interesting kind of integration with kind of mainstream services, since in a city like Winnipeg, for example, so many Indigenous children live like all over the city, like we all do. So this is an interesting question, but some really exciting work is happening. If you haven't taken a look, you might want to see what the Métis Federation is doing. They've recently started 12 new childcare centers with Indigenous sensitive programming. We have a number of North End communities starting up Indigenous sensitive programming, culturally appropriate, trying to build links. So as soon as you start tugging at this, the project gets deeper and bigger rather than appearing more contained. But yes, certainly that's going to be enormously important, particularly in Western Canada. You know, I think the last figures I've seen is something like 1 in 3 or 4 Manitoba preschoolers is Indigenous. Mm-hmm. So this is an important opportunities for our province. I will point out that building Indigenous early learning and childcare was one of the calls of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So it's on everybody's agenda.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that that enlightening talk, and everybody for your great questions. So we'll conclude the keynote, and thank Dr. Prentice again.
Thank you.